Ma'am, put the bread down and don't move. The elderly woman froze on the rain-soaked sidewalk, clutching a small paper bag against her chest. She was 72 years old, trembling, and accused of stealing a single loaf of bread. Then the officer gave an order no one expected. "Ranger, restrain her." The German shepherd lunged forward. People gasped, but just inches from the old woman, Ranger suddenly stopped. His ears dropped. His entire body began to tremble. Then the woman looked into his eyes and whispered one word. "Ranger?" The police dog whimpered. Instead of taking her down, he pressed his head against her knees and refused to let the officers come any closer. Because Ranger knew exactly who this woman was. She was the mother of the handler he had lost years ago. And what began with one loaf of bread was about to reunite a family that had been broken for far too long. Before we begin, please like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today?
A thin November rain drifted over the small Oregon town, darkening the sidewalks and pressing red maple leaves flat against the pavement. The morning was cold enough for breath to show faintly in the air, while warm yellow light spilled from neighborhood shops onto the wet street. Margaret Harris walked slowly beneath a faded navy umbrella, one gloved hand wrapped around its wooden handle and the other tucked inside the pocket of her old green wool coat. At 72, Margaret was a small woman, barely 5'3", with narrow shoulders that had grown slightly stooped with age. Her silver-gray hair was cut short around her ears, though the damp weather had already curled a few strands against her forehead. Fine lines surrounded her pale blue eyes, giving her face the soft, weathered appearance of someone who had spent a lifetime worrying about other people before remembering herself. She had been widowed for years and lived alone in an aging white house several blocks away. Solitude had made Margaret quieter, but not bitter. She still greeted neighbors, still remembered birthdays, and still left bowls of water outside during hot summers for passing dogs. She disliked being fussed over and had the stubborn dignity of a woman who would rather mend the same coat 3 times than admit she needed a new one. Every Friday morning, Margaret walked to Maple Street Bakery. The routine mattered to her. She would buy one small loaf of bread, usually the plain country wheat because it cost less than the sweeter varieties. Then sit at the table by the front window for a few minutes. She liked watching people hurry through their mornings while she warmed her hands around whatever complimentary coffee was left in the pot that morning. However, the bakery was unusually crowded. A construction crew had stopped in for breakfast. 2 mothers were trying to settle restless children, and several commuters crowded near the counter waiting for coffee. Behind the register stood Keith Torres, a 27-year-old employee who had been working at the bakery for only 3 weeks. Keith was tall and lean, with thick black hair that he kept pushed beneath a gray baseball cap. His brown eyes moved quickly from customer to customer, and his nervous habit of rubbing the back of his neck appeared whenever the line grew too long. He was not cruel, but he was anxious about making mistakes, having lost his previous job after repeatedly arriving late while caring for his sick father. Keith had become determined to prove himself reliable. Sometimes that determination made him react before thinking. "Morning, Mrs. Harris," called another employee while carrying a tray toward the kitchen. Margaret smiled. "Morning, dear." She waited patiently beside the bread shelves while a little boy argued passionately with his mother about why chocolate cake should count as breakfast. Margaret chuckled under her breath. "He makes a convincing case," she said. The exhausted mother laughed. "Please don't encourage him." Margaret selected a small loaf wrapped in brown paper. When she reached the counter, Keith was juggling 3 orders at once. "1 second, ma'am," he said, without looking up. "No hurry." Margaret placed several folded dollar bills and coins beside the register. Then she slipped a small handwritten note beneath them. Keith turned to answer a customer asking about an allergy ingredient. At the same moment, another employee set down a metal tray holding paper cups and pastry bags. The tray covered Margaret's money completely. Margaret waited. 10 seconds, 20. The line behind her continued to grow. Thinking Keith had seen the payment, she gave him a small nod he did not notice. picked up her loaf, and stepped away. She paused beside the window, as she usually did, but all the tables were occupied. "Well," she murmured to herself, "looks like the chair has found younger company today." She tucked the loaf carefully into a brown paper bag and walked toward the door. A brass bell jingled overhead as she stepped into the drizzle. Keith looked up. His eyes went immediately to the empty spot beside the register, then to the door, then to Margaret disappearing beneath her umbrella. "Wait." He looked toward the counter. "I didn't ring her up." One of the other workers barely heard him over the noise. "What?" "That woman." Keith pointed through the window. "She took a loaf." "Margaret. You know her." But the employee had already turned away to retrieve another order. Keith glanced down at the register. No transaction. No receipt. From where he stood, the situation seemed obvious. He hurried to the door and called outside. "Ma'am." Margaret did not hear him. Rain tapped steadily against her umbrella as she continued down Maple Street. Keith hesitated. He had been told during training that thefts had to be reported. The bakery had experienced several small shoplifting incidents during the previous month, and the owner had reminded employees not to ignore them simply because the items were inexpensive. Keith pulled out his phone. He made the call. By the time Margaret had walked 3 blocks, the rain had grown slightly heavier. She moved carefully because wet leaves could be treacherous beneath her worn brown shoes. The paper bag was held close beneath her coat to keep the bread dry. Behind her, a police cruiser turned onto the street. Then another vehicle followed. Margaret did not notice until she heard a short burst from a siren. She stopped. Across the road, a few pedestrians turned. Officer Noah Ramirez stepped from the first cruiser. Noah was 38. Broad-shouldered without being imposing, with close-cropped dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard beginning to show the first traces of gray near his chin. His brown eyes were observant rather than hard. 12 years in patrol had taught him that frightened people often behaved differently from guilty ones, and he had developed a reputation for asking a second question when others might settle for the first answer. He wore a dark Navy patrol uniform beneath a rain jacket, and water gathered along the brim of his cap as he approached. "Ma'am." Margaret turned. Her expression changed immediately. "Yes. Could you stop there for me, please?" She did. A second officer emerged from the canine vehicle. Officer Daniel Mercer, 41, was Ranger's current handler. He was a sturdy man with sandy brown hair cut short and a serious, disciplined face. Daniel believed strongly in procedure. Though he was generally patient with civilians, he had handled Ranger for almost 3 years and trusted the dog's judgment almost as much as his own. Then Ranger stepped down from the vehicle. The 7-year-old German Shepherd was large even for his breed, with a powerful black and tan frame, deep chest, and intelligent amber-brown eyes. The fur around his muzzle had begun to silver slightly, giving him the dignified appearance of a veteran who had seen more than he could explain. His ears remained erect, and his movements were controlled and economical. Ranger was neither nervous nor excitable. Years of police training had taught him when to wait, when to watch, and when to act. He stood beside Daniel, rain beating across his dark coat. Margaret stared at the officers. Noah kept several feet between them. "Were you just at Maple Street Bakery?" "Yes." "Did you leave with a loaf of bread?" Margaret looked down at the bag beneath her coat. "Yes." Her confusion deepened. "Is there a problem?" "We received a report that the bread may not have been paid for." For several seconds, Margaret simply stared at him. Then something almost wounded passed over her face. "Not paid for." "Yes, ma'am." Margaret straightened as much as her back allowed. "I paid for it." Noah noticed the change in her voice. Not anger, exactly. Humiliation. "I put the money on the counter. Do you have a receipt?" "No." He was busy. Behind them, another car pulled up. Keith climbed out of the passenger side, having come with an employee who wanted to clarify the situation. His gray bakery apron was still tied around his waist. "That's her," Keith said, breathing quickly. "That's the woman." Margaret turned toward him. "Young man, I paid you." Keith shook his head. "No, ma'am. You walked out. There was no payment in the register. I left cash. I didn't see any cash. Margaret hugged the paper bag tighter. This is only my bread. Her voice had become smaller. Noah glanced toward Keith. You actually saw her leave without placing money down. Keith hesitated. I saw her leave with the bread. I didn't ring up a sale. That wasn't my question. Keith looked unsettled. I was helping other customers, but the register shows nothing. Daniel remained near Ranger, listening. A few people had stopped beneath shop awnings to watch. Margaret noticed them. That seemed to trouble her more than the officers. Her cheeks flushed beneath the cold. I'm not a thief. No one has said you are. Noah replied calmly. We're trying to understand what happened. Keith shifted uneasily. She should come back to the store. I will, Margaret said. If you want to count the pennies yourselves, I will show you exactly where I put them. Her hand trembled around the paper bag. Ranger noticed. His head lifted. Until that moment. The German Shepherd had been quietly scanning the street as trained. Now his attention narrowed. He stared directly at Margaret. Daniel felt the leash change tension. Ranger. The dog did not look at him. Margaret took one nervous step backward when she noticed the canine watching her. Ranger's ears shifted forward, then sideways. His nose lifted toward the damp air. He inhaled. Once. Again. Something changed. The rigid professionalism in his posture seemed to loosen for a moment. His eyes remained fixed on the old woman. Noah saw it. You okay there? Ranger. Daniel frowned. He's fine. But Ranger was not behaving normally. He did not bark. He did not advance. Instead, a faint tremor passed through his shoulders. Margaret looked at the large dog. Uncertain why the animal's stare made something deep inside her chest tighten. Daniel shortened the leash slightly. Stay. Ranger remained still. Keith stepped forward. She needs to come back inside so we can sort this out. Margaret startled at the sudden movement and drew the bag closer to herself. Ranger immediately shifted his weight. Daniel saw the motion and responded according to training. Ranger. Forward. The German Shepherd's muscles tightened. Rain slid from the tips of his ears. Daniel gave the command again, firmer this time. Forward. Ranger stared at Margaret. His body trembled once. Then the highly trained police dog did something Daniel Mercer had almost never seen him do. Nothing. Ranger stood perfectly still in the middle of the rain-soaked sidewalk. Rain whispered against the sidewalk as Daniel Mercer tightened his grip on Ranger's leash. The German Shepherd remained exactly where he had stopped, 4 paws planted on the wet concrete, his powerful body rigid beneath the dark sheen of rainwater. Ranger, Daniel repeated, his voice firmer now. Forward. Nothing. Daniel's brow furrowed. In almost 3 years of working together, Ranger had occasionally hesitated when a situation changed unexpectedly, but he had never simply ignored a clear command. The dog understood the word. His ears had moved when Daniel spoke. He had heard him perfectly. Yet, Ranger continued staring at Margaret Harris. Margaret took one cautious step backward. The brown paper bag pressed against her chest crinkled beneath her fingers. Her face had gone pale, and, for a moment, Noah Ramirez thought she was afraid Ranger might suddenly charge. Easy. Ma'am, Noah said, keeping his tone calm. Nobody wants anyone getting hurt. I'm not doing anything. Margaret whispered. I know. Just stay where you are. Keith Torres stood several yards behind the officers, rain darkening the shoulders of his bakery uniform. His earlier certainty had begun to fade. This was no longer the simple shoplifting report he thought he had made. He had expected an officer to ask the woman to return to the bakery, perhaps check the register, and settle the matter. He had not expected a canine, and he certainly had not expected the canine to refuse its handler. Daniel gave the leash a slight guiding motion. Come on, Ranger! The German Shepherd shifted his front paw. For half a second, Daniel thought the dog was finally responding. Instead, Ranger lifted his nose. He sniffed the air. Once. Twice. His amber-brown eyes narrowed. Margaret stared at him. Something in her expression changed. Fear did not disappear completely, but another emotion moved slowly across her face, deeper and stranger. Her eyebrows drew together. She tilted her head as though trying to recognize an old song being played from another room. Ranger's ears moved forward. Margaret's lips parted. She looked at the silver beginning around his muzzle, then at the dark saddle across his back, then at his eyes. Her paper bag slipped slightly beneath her arm. "No," she whispered. Noah heard her. "What is it?" Margaret did not answer. She took a tiny step closer. Daniel immediately raised one hand. "Ma'am, please stay where you are." But Margaret seemed barely aware of him now. Her attention belonged entirely to the dog. Ranger began breathing faster, not the sharp pantings of aggression. Something softer, uncertain, almost emotional. Margaret's eyes widened. Ranger. The name left her mouth so quietly that Noah wondered whether he had heard correctly. Daniel certainly had. His head snapped toward her. Keith blinked. Even Ranger changed instantly. His ears rose high. His entire body seemed to unlock. Daniel stared at Margaret. "How do you know his name?" Margaret did not answer. Ranger gave a sound from deep in his throat. Not a growl, a whimper. Margaret covered her mouth with one hand. "Oh." Ranger pulled forward. Daniel instinctively tightened the leash. "Ranger, stay." The dog pulled again. Harder. Ranger for the first time. Urgency entered Daniel's voice. The German shepherd twisted his shoulders and surged forward with unexpected strength. Daniel was forced to step after him to keep his balance. Noah moved slightly between Margaret and the dog. "Daniel, I've got him." But the words had barely left Daniel's mouth when Ranger lunged again. This time, Daniel loosened the leash rather than risk choking him. Ranger rushed toward Margaret. Keith sucked in a breath. "Watch out." Margaret did not move. The paper bag fell from her hands. It struck the sidewalk, and the loaf rolled halfway out of the torn brown paper. Ranger reached her, but there was no attack, no bark, no raised teeth. The large German shepherd stopped so close that his shoulder brushed Margaret's coat. Then he lowered his head and pressed it firmly against her knees. Margaret gasped. Both hands came down automatically. Her fingers buried themselves in the wet fur around Ranger's neck. The dog leaned harder against her. A trembling whine escaped him. Margaret's knees seemed ready to fail. "Oh, my God!" Her voice broke. She bent carefully, placing both weathered hands on either side of Ranger's face. The dog looked up at her. Rain ran along the silver hairs around his muzzle. Margaret stared into those amber eyes for several long seconds, then tears filled her own. "Oh, my God," she whispered again. "You're alive." Nobody spoke. Even the rain seemed quieter. Daniel stood several feet away, holding a leash that had suddenly become almost meaningless. He had seen Ranger track fugitives through woods, locate missing children, search vehicles, and remain focused while sirens screamed around him. He had never seen him like this. Ranger pushed his nose into Margaret's palms. She laughed once through her tears, a fragile little sound that carried more disbelief than joy. "You remember me." Ranger whimpered again. He lifted one paw and placed it carefully against the toe of her worn brown shoe. Margaret stroked his ears in a familiar rhythm. Left ear first, then right. Then her thumb moved gently across the narrow patch of fur between his eyes. Ranger closed them. Daniel's expression changed. That was not the reaction of a dog tolerating a stranger. That was familiarity. Deep familiarity. Noah saw it too. He crouched slightly but did not approach. "Mrs. Harris," he said carefully. "You know this dog?" Margaret looked up at him, still holding Ranger's face. She swallowed. "I know those eyes." Ranger lowered himself to the sidewalk beside her feet. It was raining hard enough now that water collected beneath his chest, but he did not seem to care. He settled against Margaret's ankles with a long breath. as though he had finally arrived somewhere he had been trying to find for years. Daniel stared. He never lies down during an active stop. Noah looked at him. Never. Not unless I tell him. Ranger rested his chin across Margaret's shoe. Noah's attention shifted from the dog to the old woman. Something about this situation was becoming increasingly wrong. Not dangerous, wrong. The bread, her embarrassment. The cash she claimed to have left. And now a police dog behaving as if this frail woman were someone he had once trusted completely. Keith took a cautious step closer. I don't understand. Margaret looked toward him. Her tears had not disappeared, but the vulnerability in her face sharpened into dignity again. Neither do I, young man. A voice suddenly came from across the street. Margaret, everyone turned. An older woman was hurrying toward them beneath a bright red raincoat. Helen Mitchell was 67, round-faced and energetic, with short white curls escaping from beneath a knitted hat. She was a retired elementary school secretary who had spent 35 years remembering children's lunch money. Forgotten mittens, allergies, birthdays, and family troubles. Retirement had not reduced her instinct to involve herself whenever someone in the neighborhood needed help. She lived 2 houses from Margaret and had been her closest neighbor for nearly a decade. Helen ignored the rain and hurried across the street. What happened? Noah stepped toward her. Ma'am, please stay behind. That's Margaret Harris, I understand. Then why are police surrounding her? Margaret sighed. Helen? No, absolutely not. Helen looked from Noah to Daniel, then down at Ranger curled against Margaret's feet. Her anger momentarily turned into confusion. And whose dog is that? He's a police cane, Daniel replied. Helen stared at him. Well, he seems to have more sense than everybody else standing here. Keith looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, there was a report of stolen property. Helen turned toward him. Stolen property, a loaf of bread. Helen stared. Then she looked at the loaf lying partly exposed on the sidewalk. That Keith shifted his weight. She left without paying. No, I didn't, Margaret said quietly. Helen's face hardened. I have watched this woman return 50 cents to a cashier because she was given too much change. Keith opened his mouth, but Helen continued. And half the time she buys food. She doesn't even keep all of it. Noah's attention sharpened. What do you mean? Helen hesitated. Margaret looked at her. Helen, please. But the older woman was too angry to stop. She takes food to people around St. Andrews. Margaret's shoulders lowered. Helen, to the men who sleep near the church steps. Helen continued. Especially when the shelter is full. Keith looked down at the bread. Helen pointed toward it. You're accusing a 72-year-old widow of stealing 1 loaf when I've watched her walk through rain to give away food she could barely afford herself. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. I didn't want everyone knowing. Helen's expression softened immediately. I know. Noah looked at Margaret differently now. There was still an investigation to complete. The bakery still had to verify whether money had been left. He could not simply assume innocence because someone spoke well of her. But instinct told him the bread was no longer the most important thing on that sidewalk. There was another story here, perhaps several. Ranger suddenly raised his head. Margaret looked down at the collar around his neck. Her fingers moved gently through the wet fur until they touched the thick working collar Daniel used on duty. Then she noticed something. A small, worn mark near the leather edge. Her face changed again. She leaned closer. Daniel watched her carefully. Margaret touched the collar as if it carried a memory only she could see. Then she looked at Daniel. Officer, yes, ma'am. Her voice trembled. Who handled him before you? Daniel glanced at Noah. Margaret looked back down at Ranger. The dog rose slightly and pushed his head beneath her hand. She whispered his name again. Ranger. Then she lifted her eyes toward Noah. There was no fear in them now, only confusion, and something close to heartbreak. "Where is Jeremy?" Noah frowned. Jeremy Margaret tightened her hand gently around Ranger's collar. "Why is my son's dog here?" For several seconds, no one answered Margaret's question. Rain continued to tick against the awnings and the roofs of the parked cruisers. Ranger remained close to her legs, his wet shoulder pressed against the hem of her green coat, as though he had quietly decided that whatever happened next, he was not leaving her side. Jeremy Noah repeated. Margaret looked at him as if the name should already explain everything. Jeremy Howard. My son. She glanced down at Ranger, then back toward Daniel. This was his dog. Daniel Mercer's expression changed. He looked at Ranger with new understanding, then reached for the small tablet kept in the canine vehicle. "I've only handled Ranger for 3 years," he said. "There were handlers before me." Margaret gave a faint, almost wounded smile. There was one before all the others. Noah watched Daniel open Ranger's service records. Some of the older files took several seconds to load. Ranger had worked long enough that his history stretched across multiple assignments. Training evaluations, medical examinations, handler transfers, and certifications. Then Daniel stopped scrolling. There it is. Noah stepped beside him. The screen showed an old department photograph. A younger Ranger sat upright beside a uniformed officer. Officer Jeremy Howard, Canine Unit. Margaret turned away before anyone could see the tears gathering in her eyes. Daniel read quietly. Primary handler for Ranger's first 4 years of active police service. Advanced tracking, certification. Missing person recovery. Narcotics detection. Commendation for civilian rescue. He stopped. There were several more commendations. Jeremy Howard had not merely worked with Ranger. He had been one of the most highly rated handlers in the regional canine program. Noah studied the photograph. Jeremy had been in his mid-30s then, tall and athletic, with sandy blonde hair cut close at the sides and a square. Open face. Even in an official photograph, there was something relaxed about him. One hand rested naturally against a Ranger's shoulder rather than holding him rigidly in place. "Your son was his first police handler?" Noah asked. Margaret nodded. "His first real one." Ranger looked up when she spoke. Margaret slowly scratched behind his left ear. "He used to bring this rascal home every chance he got." Daniel smiled faintly. "Rascal. You didn't know him when he was young." For the first time since the officers had stopped her, warmth entered Margaret's voice. "When Jeremy brought Ranger home after his first week with the unit, that dog stole half a roasted chicken from my kitchen counter." Daniel looked down at his disciplined canine. Ranger. He had no shame. Noah almost smiled. Margaret bent slightly and rubbed the fur beneath Ranger's jaw. "I made chicken on Sundays. After that first theft, I started cooking an extra piece for him. Jeremy complained I was ruining his working dog." "What did you tell him?" Noah asked. "That a dog could catch criminals and still have decent manners at the dinner table." Daniel laughed softly. Ranger's tail tapped once against the sidewalk. The movement nearly broke Margaret's heart. She remembered rainy evenings when Jeremy had arrived at her house after a long shift. Ranger would burst through the front door first, shaking rainwater across the entryway while Margaret scolded him with absolutely no effect. She kept an old towel behind the kitchen door specifically for him. "Feet," she would say. And Ranger, who could follow complex tactical commands under pressure, would reluctantly stand while Margaret wiped each muddy paw. Then he would trot directly to the kitchen drawer where she kept his treats. He remembered the drawer, Margaret said, smiling through her sadness. No matter how long it had been, he always went straight to it. Noah looked down at the dog lying against her shoe. "So he didn't just visit occasionally." Margaret shook her head. "Sometimes Jeremy worked odd shifts. Sometimes training ran late. Ranger stayed with me often. There were weeks when I saw more of that dog than I saw of my son." She sighed. Jeremy used to joke that Ranger had 2 handlers, one with a badge and one with an apron. Daniel looked at Ranger again. The strange behavior on the sidewalk suddenly made perfect sense. Ranger had not recognized a random woman. He had recognized home, not a building, not an address, a person. Noah's eyes returned to the file. Then he saw another entry. His expression became serious. "Daniel?" Daniel followed his gaze. A report from several years earlier was attached to Jeremy's personnel history. Line of duty injury. Noah read enough to understand the outline. Jeremy had been badly injured during a night operation involving a fleeing vehicle. The collision had left him with severe injuries to his right leg and hip. After several surgeries and months of rehabilitation, doctors determined that returning to full canine duty was unlikely. Margaret noticed the silence. That was the night everything changed. She said. Her voice became quieter. "Jeremy called me from the hospital before surgery. He tried to sound cheerful. Told me it looked worse than it was." She looked into the distance. It was worse than he said. Ranger lifted his head. Margaret's fingers moved slowly through his fur. "For months, my son measured his life in hospital rooms and physical therapy appointments. Before the accident. Jeremy could barely sit still. He ran every morning. He hiked. He trained Ranger for hours. Suddenly, just walking across a room became a victory." Noah said nothing. He knew enough about people to understand that some wounds were hardest on those who had built their identity around strength. "What happened to Ranger?" he asked. Jeremy couldn't work with him anymore. Daniel checked the records. He was temporarily assigned to another handler while Officer Howard underwent rehabilitation. Then the transfer became permanent. Margaret nodded. They told Jeremy it was best for Ranger, and Jeremy agreed. Her mouth tightened. But agreeing with something doesn't mean it doesn't break your heart. Ranger shifted closer. Margaret rested a hand on his head. After Ranger left, Jeremy stopped asking about the unit. He stopped keeping his old photographs where he could see them. Then he stopped talking about work altogether. Noah looked at the personnel file. Jeremy eventually received a medical separation from active canine duty. There were no disciplinary issues, no misconduct, no scandal, just an injured officer whose career had ended before he was ready. "Where is your son now?" Noah asked. Margaret's hand stopped moving. "I don't know." That answer surprised him. "You don't know. He left town. When? Almost 2 years ago." Helen, who had remained nearby, lowered her eyes. Her anger from earlier had disappeared, replaced by concern. Margaret continued. At first, Jeremy called every week, then every other week, then once a month. She forced a small smile. "You know children, they grow up and become terribly busy pretending they don't need their mothers." But the humor failed before the sentence ended. The calls got shorter. Eventually, there were only messages at Christmas, my birthday, sometimes not even those. "Did something happen between you?" Noah asked. Margaret shook her head. "Not that I know of." She stared down at Ranger. "I kept wondering whether I had said something wrong, whether asking about his leg bothered him, whether seeing me reminded him of who he used to be." Her eyes glistened. "Eventually, I decided maybe he wanted a clean break from everything here." Noah did not like that explanation. Not because Margaret was lying, because it sounded like the explanation of someone who had been forced to invent answers in the absence of real ones. He looked again at Jeremy's record. A man whose entire life had revolved around service. His canine partner. And his physical ability had lost all three within a short period. There was more to this story. Noah was certain of it. Several blocks away, Emily Martinez had just returned to Maple Street Bakery. Emily was 34, medium height, with dark auburn hair usually tied into a loose bun and warm brown eyes that became sharp whenever something threatened the business she had spent 8 years building. The daughter of restaurant workers. She had grown up believing that food was not simply something sold across a counter. A neighborhood bakery, in her mind, should know who needed extra coffee, whose children liked cinnamon rolls, and who sometimes needed a little patience more than they needed exact change. When an employee told her that police had been called over Margaret Harris and a loaf of bread, Emily's face went still. Margaret. Keith had not yet returned. Emily walked directly to the register. Show me the camera. She rewound the security footage. There was Margaret approaching the counter. Keith turned away. Margaret placed something down. Emily paused the video. She zoomed in. Several folded bills, coins, then a handwritten note. A metal tray came down on top of them seconds later. Emily closed her eyes. Oh, Keith. She lifted the tray. The money was still there. So was the note. Emily picked it up. In Margaret's careful handwriting were 6 words. Thank you. Have a warm morning. Emily stared at the sentence. Then she grabbed her coat. Back on the sidewalk. Noah was still studying Ranger's records when Emily came hurrying around the corner. She was breathing hard. Officer. Margaret looked up. Emily stopped several feet away, holding the damp bills and the small note. Margaret, I am so sorry. Keith, standing farther back, went pale. Emily held up the money. She paid. Noah looked toward Keith. The young man stared at the bills. The tray covered it. Emily said, It's all on camera. Keith lowered his head. Margaret did not celebrate being proven right. She only looked tired. Emily stepped closer. I should never have let this happen. You weren't there, Margaret said softly. That doesn't make it less embarrassing for you. Keith approached slowly. Mrs. Harris. Margaret looked at him. He swallowed. I made a mistake. Before he could say anything more, Noah raised a hand gently. They would deal with apologies. But first he wanted answers about something else. He returned to Ranger's file and searched the administrative section attached to Jeremy Howard's employment records. Old address, forwarding address, emergency contacts. Then a more recent update appeared. Noah frowned. What? Daniel leaned closer. Noah read the entry twice. It had been added months after Jeremy left town. A residential address, still in Oregon. Noah checked the location. Then he looked at Margaret. She was standing beneath the gray morning sky with Ranger against her leg. Unaware of what he had just discovered, Jeremy Howard had not disappeared across the country. He had not moved somewhere unreachable. According to the most recent record, Margaret's son was living less than 3 hours away. The rain had softened by the time Emily Martinez stood in front of Margaret Harris, holding the folded bills and coins that had been found beneath the metal tray. For a moment, nobody spoke. Keith Torres stood several feet away with his shoulders lowered, looking as if he wished the wet sidewalk would open and swallow him whole. Noah Ramirez watched Margaret carefully. Ranger remained close against her leg, calmer now but still unwilling to move far from her. Emily held out the money. Margaret, please, take this back. Margaret looked at the bills, then at Emily. No. Emily blinked. You already paid. I know. That's why I'm giving it back. Margaret gently pushed Emily's hand away. No. Dear. Emily frowned. After what happened. The bread is on the house. Margaret's expression softened, but she did not change her mind. That would be very kind. Then take your money. Margaret shook her head. No, there was nothing dramatic in the way she said it. No anger, no pride meant to embarrass anyone, just a quiet firmness that seemed stronger than shouting. Emily tried again. Margaret, you were stopped by police because of our mistake. I think we can afford to give you 1 loaf of bread. Margaret glanced down at the torn paper bag lying near the curb. Then she looked at the officers. At Keith. At the people still watching from beneath awnings across the street. Her back straightened slightly. If I am still strong enough to walk into your store, she said, then I am still dignified enough to pay for what I buy. The words settled over the sidewalk. Noah felt something tighten in his chest. During 12 years in patrol, he had met people angry about $10, people ashamed to ask for help, people who hid desperation behind humor, and people who hid pride behind anger. Margaret was different. She was not refusing charity because she hated kindness. She was protecting something she could still control, her dignity. Emily looked down at the money in her palm. All right, she said quietly. Then I'll accept it. Margaret nodded. Thank you. Keith lowered his head further. Noah noticed. The young man's earlier defensiveness was gone. He looked toward Margaret. "Mrs. Harris?" Margaret turned to him. "I really am sorry." She studied his face for a moment. "You made a mistake." Keith swallowed. "Yes, ma'am. So try not to make the same one twice." He nodded quickly. "I won't." Margaret looked at the gray sky. "That's usually the most useful thing we can do with a mistake." Helen Mitchell, standing nearby in her red raincoat, let out a small approving sound. "That," she said, "is why arguing with Margaret is exhausting." Margaret gave her a sideways look. "No one asked you." Helen smiled, for the first time since the incident began. Noah saw Margaret smile too. It was brief, but it changed the whole sidewalk. A few minutes later, they returned to Maple Street Bakery. Emily insisted everyone come inside to get out of the cold. Ranger entered beside Daniel but kept turning his head toward Margaret. Every few steps. He checked that she was still there. The bakery had quieted after the morning rush. Steam clouded the windows. The smell of fresh bread, cinnamon, and coffee filled the room. Outside. Rain traced silver lines down the glass. Emily brought Margaret a fresh loaf to replace the one that had fallen. Margaret immediately reached for her purse. Emily raised both hands. "No, that one is replacing the damaged one." Margaret considered this. "That is acceptable." Helen laughed. "Careful. Emily, you've discovered the rules." Margaret sat at her usual window table. Ranger settled nearby. Noah remained standing for a moment, thinking about Jeremy's address, but before he could ask Margaret anything else. Helen sat across from her and noticed the small loaf on the table. Her expression changed. "You're still doing it." Margaret looked up. Doing what Helen pointed toward the bread, buying the smallest one. Margaret's mouth tightened. "Helen." Noah noticed the warning in her voice. Helen ignored it. "You used to buy two. That was years ago. And you used to buy coffee. I drink coffee at home. You barely drink anything at home except hot water with lemon." Margaret sighed. "Helen." Noah took a seat at the neighboring table. He did not want to intrude, but something about the conversation connected with the feeling he had earlier. There was more behind the bread. Helen turned toward him. "Officer, do you know why she walks here instead of buying groceries once a week like a normal person?" Margaret gave her a sharp look. "I am a normal person. Debatable." Daniel almost smiled. Helen continued. "Because she counts every dollar." Margaret's face hardened. "That is none of their business." Noah answered gently. "It doesn't have to be." Helen looked apologetic now, but she was already committed. "Her roof started leaking last winter." Margaret closed her eyes. "Helen." The back section. Helen lowered her voice. It got worse during the spring storms. Noah looked at Margaret. She was staring at the table. Helen continued more carefully. She got an estimate for repairs. It was more than she expected. "How much?" Noah asked. Margaret looked up. "That really is none of your business." He nodded. "You're right." That seemed to surprise her. Helen exhaled. "She's been saving from her monthly checks." Margaret folded her hands together. "The roof needs fixing. That is all?" Helen shook her head. "It's not all." Margaret's eyes flashed. "Helen." But Helen's expression softened. "You're behind on the electric bill." Margaret said nothing. "And the heating bill." Still nothing. Emily, listening from behind the counter, slowly stopped wiping down the register. Noah understood now. The cheap loaf, the long walk, the refusal to accept a free replacement. Margaret was not merely careful with money. She was stretching it. "Why didn't you ask anyone for help?" Emily asked. Margaret looked almost offended. "Ask who, me?" "For money." "For anything." Margaret gave a tiny shake of her head. I have managed this long. Helen leaned forward. You have managed by keeping your heat low and wearing 2 sweaters indoors. Margaret looked away. That is called being practical. No, Helen said. That is called being stubborn. For a moment, the 2 older women stared at each other. Then Margaret sighed. I am 72. I've earned the right to be stubborn. That part is true. A faint ripple of laughter moved through the room. But Noah was not laughing. He was watching the loaf. You said earlier she gives food away. He said. Helen's eyes shifted toward Margaret. Margaret immediately shook her head. No. Noah looked between them. No, that is not relevant. Helen spoke anyway. She cuts the loaf in half. Margaret's face reddened. Helen Mitchell. 1 half she keeps. Helen looked at Noah. The other half goes to a man who sits near St. Andrew's. Noah remembered the old stone church several blocks west of the bakery. He's homeless. Helen nodded. Most days. Margaret stared down at her hands. He has a name. Noah waited. Thomas. She said. Her voice was quieter. He used to work maintenance at a warehouse. Lost his job, then his apartment. You know him well. Yo. Margaret looked toward the window. But that doesn't mean he should be hungry. Emily stared at the loaf. So, today. Margaret knew what she meant, yes. She touched the paper wrapping. Half was for me. She paused. Half was for Thomas. Keith, standing near the counter, looked as if someone had struck him. The bread he had believed she stole was not even entirely meant for herself. Noah felt the entire morning rearrange itself in his mind. An elderly woman, living carefully enough to worry about heating bills, had still set aside half of what little she bought for someone with less. And the entire situation had begun because people had seen an old woman carrying bread and decided they already understood her. Emily turned toward the register. Then she looked around the bakery, at the bread racks, at the customers, at Keith. An idea settled over her face. She disappeared into the storage room. When she returned, she carried a small wooden box. It had once held tea packets. Emily placed it beside the register. Then she took a black marker and a piece of white cardstock. She wrote carefully, "Take what you need, leave what you can." Margaret watched. "What are you doing?" Emily propped the sign against the box. "Starting something I should have started years ago." She looked toward the customers. "Anyone who wants to can pay for an extra loaf. Anyone who needs one can take it, no questions." Margaret frowned. "People may abuse that." Emily shrugged. "Maybe." "And you're still doing it?" "Yes." Margaret considered the box, then nodded once. "Good." Keith stepped forward. He reached into his pocket, pulled out several folded bills, and placed them into the box. Everyone watched. Keith's face reddened. "I think I owe the first one." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled faintly. "No." Keith froze. "You owe the second one." He looked confused. Margaret pointed at herself. "I already paid for the first." Keith laughed before he could stop himself. So did Helen. Even Noah smiled. Later that afternoon, after Margaret had gone home with Helen and Ranger had reluctantly returned to duty with Daniel, Noah sat inside his cruiser with Jeremy Howard's address pulled up on the computer. 3 hours away. He found a phone number attached to an old departmental contact record. Noah hesitated before calling. The line rang 4 times. Then someone answered. "Hello." The voice belonged to a man, older than Noah expected, tired. "Is this Jeremy Howard?" A pause. "Who's asking?" "Officer Noah Ramirez." "I'm calling from your former department." Silence. Noah continued. "This is about Ranger." The silence changed. "What happened to him?" "He's fine." A breath released softly on the other end. Noah looked through the windshield at the rain. He encountered someone today. Who? Noah chose the words carefully. Margaret Harris. Nothing. No response, no breathing, no movement. Mr. Howard. The silence lasted so long that Noah checked whether the call had disconnected. Then Jeremy spoke. My mother, yes. Another pause. And Ranger. He recognized her. Noah heard Jeremy inhale, slowly, painfully. Noah waited. Finally, he said, She asked about you? Jeremy said nothing. She doesn't understand why you left. Still nothing. Noah looked at the address on the screen. You're only a few hours away. Jeremy's voice changed. It grew quieter, guarded. Officer. Yes, don't tell her. Noah frowned. Tell her what? That you found me. The line went silent again. Then Jeremy said, almost in a whisper, Don't tell my mother you found me. Noah kept the phone against his ear but did not answer immediately. Outside the cruiser. The late afternoon rain had thinned to a silver mist, leaving the town washed clean and strangely quiet. Cars moved slowly over the wet road, their tires whispering across the pavement, somewhere beyond the windshield. People were returning to ordinary routines, but inside the cruiser, Noah could hear the strain in Jeremy Howard's breathing. Don't tell my mother you found me, Jeremy repeated. Noah looked down at the address glowing on the patrol computer. I won't, he said. Jeremy seemed surprised by the answer. You won't. Not if you're asking me not to. Another silence followed. Noah leaned back in his seat. But I'd like to understand why. I don't owe the department an explanation. No, Noah said. You don't. That took some of the tension out of Jeremy's voice. Noah continued carefully. I'm not calling as an investigator. Your mother hasn't done anything wrong. Ranger hasn't done anything wrong. I just spent the morning watching a 72-year-old woman look at that dog like someone had handed her back a piece of her family. Nothing came from the other end. Noah waited. Years of police work had taught him that silence sometimes opened doors that questions only slammed shut. Finally, Jeremy exhaled. What does she look like? The question was so unexpected that Noah sat straighter. Your mother. Yes. Noah glanced through the windshield, remembering Margaret under the bakery lights. Small, silver hair, green wool coat, stubborn. A faint sound came through the phone, almost a laugh. That coat still has the brown buttons. I didn't inspect the buttons. They never matched. Jeremy's voice warmed for barely a second. She lost one 20 years ago and replaced all of them with buttons from one of my father's old jackets. Then the warmth disappeared. How is she? Noah chose not to lie. Proud. Jeremy understood. That bad. Her roof needs work. She has some bills piling up. I know. Noah frowned. You know. Jeremy remained quiet for a moment. I send money. That surprised Noah. Your mother doesn't think you do. She doesn't know it's from me. Jeremy shifted on the other end. Noah heard a chair creak. I set up transfers through an account attached to some of my father's old benefit paperwork. She thinks part of it comes from his survivor benefits. Why hide it? Because if she knew it was me, she'd send half of it back. Noah could not argue with that. He had known Margaret for only a few hours, and even he believed it. She might, he admitted. Jeremy gave another faint laugh. That woman once mailed me $12 because I bought her groceries when she had the flu, put it in a birthday card, and wrote. Don't get ideas. Noah smiled. Then his expression became serious again. If you still care enough to make sure she has money, why haven't you seen her in almost 2 years? The silence returned. This time it felt heavier. Jeremy finally said, You read my file, enough of it. So, you know about the crash. I know you were injured on duty. That's the clean version. Noah did not interrupt. Jeremy continued. It was supposed to be a routine perimeter assist. Stolen vehicle. Driver ran a roadblock. His voice remained steady at first, professional, as if he were reading someone else's report. I was getting Ranger out when the vehicle came back around. I moved to push him clear. Jeremy paused. My right leg got pinned between the cruiser and a concrete barrier. Noah closed his eyes briefly. They said I was lucky. Jeremy laughed without humor. People say that when they don't know what else to say. He had suffered multiple fractures in his right leg, severe damage around the hip, and nerve injuries that months of rehabilitation could only partially repair. Surgeries followed, then physical therapy, then more surgery. Before the accident. Jeremy Howard had been 40 years old, 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, and built like someone who had spent most of his adult life running beside working dogs. He had sandy blonde hair that had begun to gray near the temples and blue-gray eyes that friends once described as always looking for the next problem to solve. He had been outgoing, competitive, and almost annoyingly optimistic. The accident changed more than his gait. "I thought I'd be back in 6 months," Jeremy said. "I told everyone that." He paused, especially Mom. But 6 months became 9. 9 became 12. His right leg never regained the stability required for full canine work. He could walk, on good days. He could manage without a cane for short distances, on bad days. Pain traveled from his hip to his ankle like electricity. Then they transferred Ranger, Jeremy said. There was no bitterness toward Daniel in his voice, only absence. The department couldn't keep a working dog waiting for me. I knew that. Ranger needed to work. That didn't make it easy. No. Jeremy went silent. That dog knew when I was angry before I did. He slept outside the bathroom during my first month after surgery because I kept falling, when I couldn't bend far enough to put on my right boot. Ranger used to bring it to me. Jeremy inhaled slowly. Then, one day, another handler came for him. Noah said nothing. I told Ranger it was okay. Jeremy's voice cracked faintly. I lied to a dog. Noah looked down at his hands. Jeremy continued. First, I lost the job. Then I lost my partner. You didn't lose him. That's what it felt like. Jeremy had tried to remain connected with the department at first. He attended training evaluations, asked for updates about Ranger, even visited twice, but watching another officer give Ranger commands eventually became unbearable. Not because Jeremy resented the new handler, because Ranger responded. He adapted. He kept working. And Jeremy, who had built most of his adult identity around being a police officer and canine handler, began to believe the world had continued perfectly well without him. So, you left town, Noah said, eventually. Why leave your mother? Jeremy did not answer immediately. When I was a kid, my father died young. Noah remembered Margaret mentioning her husband only briefly. Jeremy continued. Mom kept everything together. Worked, paid bills, made sure I finished school. She never let me see her scared. His voice softened. When I became a police officer, she kept every newspaper clipping, every commendation, every photograph of Ranger and me. That sounds like a mother who was proud of you. Exactly. Noah understood before Jeremy said it. Jeremy had not been afraid that Margaret would stop loving him. He had been afraid of becoming someone different in her eyes. I went from chasing suspects through woods to needing a handrail just to get down 3 porch steps, Jeremy said. Every time she looked at me, I imagined she was remembering who I used to be. Did she ever say that no? Did she treat you differently? Jeremy hesitated. No. Noah leaned forward. Then maybe that wasn't what she saw. Jeremy did not respond. I didn't want her watching me fall apart. He finally said, his voice had grown rough. I was angry all the time. I hated physical therapy. Hated the cane. Hated seeing Ranger's old bowls at her house. Hated myself for hating any of it. So Jeremy moved away. At first, only to another town where he could be anonymous. He found a small rental, then part-time administrative work related to emergency services. He called Margaret regularly, but the calls became harder. She asked when he would visit. He always had an excuse: weather, work, appointments, eventually. Avoiding one difficult conversation became avoiding many. "I thought giving her distance would be easier," Jeremy said. For her, Jeremy did not answer. Noah knew the truth. "For you," he said. A long silence. "Yes." Jeremy's answer was barely audible. "I kept thinking I'd come home when I was better. And when was that supposed to be? When I could walk normally? When I wasn't angry? When I figured out what came next?" Noah looked toward the gray sky. "Sounds like you were waiting to become your old self." Jeremy breathed out. "Maybe. What if that man isn't coming back?" The question was not cruel. Still, Jeremy did not answer for several seconds. Then Noah said quietly, "Your mother doesn't need a canine officer." Jeremy's breathing stopped for a moment. "She doesn't need the man in the old photographs either." Noah stared out at the wet street. "She needs her son." Noah did not add anything. He had said enough. Across town, Margaret had already returned home. Daniel had driven her because the rain had become colder, and Ranger had remained in the back of the canine vehicle until they reached the narrow residential street where Margaret lived. Her house was a modest two-story home with faded white siding and dark green shutters. One section of the roof had been covered temporarily with a blue tarp, its corners weighed down against the wind. The small front yard was neatly kept despite the season, with dormant rose bushes trimmed beside the porch and a ceramic bird bath near the walkway. The moment Daniel opened the canine door, Ranger jumped down. Easy, but the dog was already staring at the house. His ears lifted. Margaret stood beside the gate for the first time that afternoon. She seemed almost afraid to move. Ranger walked toward the porch. Slowly, at first, then faster. He passed the steps and went directly to the far corner beside the wooden railing. There he stopped. Margaret covered her mouth. Daniel watched from the driveway. Ranger circled once, then lay down, exactly in the corner. "No," Margaret whispered. Helen, who had followed them home in her own car, stood beside her. What Margaret pointed, that was his place. Her eyes filled. Every night Jeremy worked late. Ranger waited there. She walked toward the porch. "Sometimes I told him Jeremy wouldn't be home for hours." A fragile laugh escaped her. "He never believed me." Ranger rested his chin on his paws. Margaret climbed the steps slowly. For a moment, the years seemed to overlap an older woman standing beneath a damaged roof. A working dog lying where he had once waited for a younger man to come home. Margaret disappeared inside. Daniel stayed near Ranger. A few minutes later she returned carrying a small wooden box darkened with age. She sat carefully on the porch step and placed it on her lap. Ranger immediately raised his head. Margaret opened the lid. Inside lay several photographs. An old police patch, a worn tennis ball, and beneath them, folded carefully against the wood, a narrow black leather collar. Margaret lifted it with trembling fingers. Ranger stood. She looked at the faded metal tag. His first collar, the one Jeremy had fastened around Ranger's neck before either of them knew how much they were going to lose. Tuttoan. Margaret Harris held the old black collar across both palms as if it were something fragile enough to break under the weight of memory. The rain had finally stopped. Evening light settled softly over the damp porch. Turning the remaining drops along the railing into tiny points of silver, Ranger stood several feet away, staring at the open wooden box on Margaret's lap. Then his nose lifted. He took one slow step toward her. Daniel Mercer watched from beside the porch rail, while Noah Ramirez stood near the bottom of the steps, giving Margaret room. Helen had gone home to change out of her soaked clothes, promising to return later with soup whether Margaret wanted it or not. Ranger approached the box. Margaret lowered the collar, "Do you remember this?" Old Boy Ranger sniffed it once, then again. His ears shifted backward. The reaction was immediate but quiet. He did not bark or wag wildly. He simply lowered himself beside Margaret, pressing one shoulder against her leg and placing his chin near the edge of the wooden box. Margaret's fingers moved through the silvering fur behind his ears. "You do remember." Noah climbed one step higher. "What was that collar from?" "Before he was really Ranger," Margaret said. Daniel glanced at her. "What do you mean?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Before Jeremy believed he could make a police dog out of him." She looked down at the old photographs inside the box. Jeremy always had a way of believing in damaged things. Her expression changed. Maybe because he was one himself for a while. Noah remained silent. Margaret drew out an old photograph. It showed a teenage boy standing beside a thin, brown and white dog with one floppy ear. That's Jeremy, yes. 16 years old and convinced the world had personally insulted him. Daniel smiled. Margaret studied the photograph. His father had been dead 8 months by then. Her husband, Robert Howard, had died suddenly after a heart attack at 49. He had been a mechanic, broad-handed and patient, the sort of father who believed broken things should be repaired before they were replaced. His death had left the house strangely silent. Jeremy had taken it badly. He stopped caring about school, Margaret said, stopped showing up some days. He was angry at teachers, angry at me, angry at God, angry at anyone who dared ask whether he was all right. Noah looked at the teenager in the photograph. What changed? Margaret tapped the image with one finger. That dog. His name had been Cooper. He was a mixed-breed stray, perhaps 2 years old, with a white chest, a brown patch over one eye, ribs that showed through his coat, and an old scar along one back leg. Someone had abandoned him near a drainage ditch outside town during winter. Jeremy found him while walking home after skipping school. He came through that door carrying 40 pounds of wet dog. Margaret said, "Dropped him on my kitchen rug and announced we were keeping him." "What did you say?" Daniel asked. I said, "Absolutely not." Noah smiled. "And we kept him." Margaret laughed softly. At first, Jeremy only fed Cooper because the dog needed him. Then he started waking early to walk him. He cleaned the wound on the dog's leg. He built a shelter in the yard, even though Cooper preferred sleeping beside Jeremy's bed. Then something unexpected happened. Jeremy began going back to school. He came home earlier. He stopped getting into arguments, not all at once, but little by little. "A counselor told me once that grief needs somewhere to go," Margaret said. Jeremy poured his into that dog. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of her voice. Margaret stroked him. "Cooper didn't fix him. That's not how life works. But he gave Jeremy a reason to get out of bed on mornings when nothing else could." Years later, after Cooper died peacefully at an old age, Jeremy kept the collar. By then he had graduated, entered law enforcement, and eventually requested assignment to the K-9 unit. He told me dogs had saved him long before he ever saved one, Margaret said. He believed they understood things people often missed. Daniel nodded slowly. "That sounds like the handler everyone told me about." Margaret looked toward him. "What did they say?" "That Jeremy never treated the dog like equipment." A sad smile appeared. "No, he never did." Ranger nudged the old collar with his nose. Then he settled again beside Margaret. Memory, Noah thought, did not always need language. Sometimes it lived in smell, in places, in the sound of a drawer opening, in one person's hand moving across a dog's head exactly the way it had years before. By the following morning, word of what had happened at Maple Street Bakery had spread across the neighborhood. Not because anyone had intended to make Margaret famous. A customer had posted about the misunderstanding online, mentioning how Police Dog had recognized her and refused to move against her. Someone else wrote about the unpaid-looking loaf that had actually been paid for. But what caught people's attention most was Helen's explanation. Margaret had been sharing her bread. The story moved through community pages, church groups, and neighborhood conversations. At first, Margaret was horrified. "I do not need strangers feeling sorry for me." She told Helen over the phone, "They don't. They are discussing my roof. Only because you have a roof that resembles a blue camping tent. Helen, I'm just saying." But something unexpected happened. People did not begin showing up at Margaret's door with pity. They started looking at one another differently. Emily Martinez arrived at Maple Street Bakery before sunrise and placed the wooden box beside the register again. This time, the handwritten sign had been replaced with a proper card in a small wooden frame. "Take what you need. Leave what you can." Below it, Emily added, "One loaf can feed more than one person." The first customer dropped in $5. The second bought an extra loaf. By 10 o'clock, 11 prepaid breads were listed on a chalkboard behind the counter. Emily decided the program would stay permanently. No speeches, no photographs, no questions asked. If someone needed bread, they could take it. If someone could pay for another person, they could leave something behind. Keith Torres arrived early for his shift. He had slept badly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret standing in the rain clutching the paper bag while he insisted she had stolen it. He had already apologized, but apology felt too easy. So he went to Emily. "I want to do something." She looked up from the bread rack. "What deliveries?" Emily raised an eyebrow. "Deliveries to older customers." Keith rubbed the back of his neck. "I have weekends free, mostly." "You hate waking up early." "I can learn." She studied him. Why, Keith looked at the wooden box, because maybe if I'd known Mrs. Harris better, I wouldn't have assumed the worst. Emily said nothing. Keith continued. "If people can't walk here, I can take bread to them." That Saturday, Keith made his first 3 deliveries. One went to a retired schoolteacher recovering from knee surgery. Another went to an 81-year-old widower whose daughter lived in another state. The third went to a woman who had not entered the bakery in months because she was afraid of falling on wet sidewalks. None of them knew about Keith's mistake. They only knew a young man had shown up holding warm bread. A small mistake had begun producing something larger than itself. Noah noticed it too. The incident that could easily have ended in resentment was quietly becoming a reason for people to pay attention. Not only to Margaret, to one another. That afternoon, Noah parked outside Margaret's house. Ranger had been allowed another short visit while Daniel completed paperwork nearby. The dog immediately returned to the porch. Margaret was inside preparing tea. Noah stood in the kitchen doorway and noticed an old ceramic mug beside the sink. Dark blue. Faded police shield on one side, the name Jeremy printed beneath it. "You kept that." Margaret glanced toward the mug. "He left it here. 2 years ago, longer." She placed a tea bag into a cup. "I keep meaning to throw it away." Noah looked at the perfectly clean mug. "You're not very convincing." Margaret smiled without turning around. Later, sitting alone in his cruiser, Noah called Jeremy again. The phone rang 3 times. Jeremy answered. "You said you wouldn't tell her." "I didn't." "Then why are you calling?" Noah looked toward Margaret's house. "Because I saw something." Jeremy sighed. "What, your coffee mug?" Silence. "Blue ceramic. Department logo. Your name on it." Jeremy did not respond. "She still keeps it by the kitchen sink." Noah waited. Nothing. "She cleans it." Still nothing. Noah lowered his voice. "I thought you should know." Jeremy's breathing became audible. Noah did not repeat his earlier advice. He did not ask Jeremy to come home. He simply ended the call with one sentence. "Good night." Jeremy. The next morning arrived pale and cold. Sunlight broke through thin clouds, lighting the wet branches along Margaret Street. Ranger lay on the porch beside the old wooden box, which Margaret had forgotten to carry inside the night before. Margaret stood behind the screen door holding a cup of tea. Then Ranger's head lifted. His ears snapped forward. A vehicle was coming slowly down the street. An old dark green pickup truck. It passed one house, then another. Ranger stood. Margaret stepped onto the porch. The pickup slowed in front of her gate. Her face tightened with confusion. The engine stopped. For one long moment. Nobody moved. Then the driver's door opened. A man climbed out. He was tall, though age and injury had changed the way he carried himself. His sandy blonde hair was now streaked heavily with gray at the temples. His shoulders were still broad beneath a worn brown canvas jacket. But he moved carefully when his right foot touched the pavement. There was a visible hitch in his step. A limp. Ranger stared at him. The man closed the truck door. Ranger's entire body went still. Then his tail moved once. Margaret's cup trembled in her hand. The man looked toward the porch, and Ranger began to run. Sold. Ranger ran across the wet front yard so fast that Daniel Mercer barely had time to react. Ranger, the German shepherd, ignored him. His paws struck the damp grass, sending tiny drops of water into the cold morning air. His ears were forward, his body stretched into a powerful sprint, but halfway between the porch and the old green pickup, something changed. Ranger slowed, then stopped. Only a few yards separated him from the man beside the truck. Jeremy Howard stood motionless. For years, Margaret had remembered her son as the strong K-9 officer who could run beside Ranger for miles without appearing tired. The man standing in front of her now was still tall, a little over 6 feet, with broad shoulders beneath a faded brown canvas jacket. But time and injury had changed him. Gray threaded heavily through his sandy blonde hair. His face was leaner than before, and faint lines had formed around his blue-gray eyes. His right leg remained slightly angled when he stood, forcing him to place more weight on the left. There was no cane in his hand that morning, but his posture revealed how carefully he balanced himself. Jeremy had once entered rooms as if nothing inside them could frighten him. Now he looked afraid of a dog, not because Ranger might attack, because Ranger might not remember. The German shepherd stared at him. Jeremy swallowed. "Come on, boy." Ranger did not move. His nose worked rapidly, pulling scent from the cool air. His tail lowered. For one terrible second. Jeremy wondered whether he had waited too long. Maybe years had taken what memory could not hold. Maybe Ranger had learned another life, another handler, another home. Jeremy's mouth tightened. "That's okay," he whispered. Margaret stood on the porch with both hands wrapped around the railing. She had not moved since seeing her son step out of the truck. Noah Ramirez stood near the walkway, silent. Daniel had loosened his hold on Ranger's lead. No one wanted to interrupt whatever was happening. Jeremy slowly lowered himself. His right knee resisted. Pain crossed his face as he bent, but he continued until he was kneeling awkwardly on the damp ground. He opened his arms. Then he said the two words he had spoken hundreds of times before patrols, searches, training exercises, and long drives home. "Hey, partner." Ranger's ears shot upright. The hesitation disappeared. He exploded forward. Jeremy barely had time to brace himself before 70 pounds of German shepherd crashed into his chest. He fell backward onto the wet grass. For a moment, everyone froze. Then Jeremy laughed. Not politely, not carefully. He laughed from somewhere deep inside himself. A sound Margaret had not heard in years. "Easy, easy, you lunatic." Ranger climbed halfway across him, whining loudly, licking his jaw, pushing his head beneath Jeremy's chin and pawing at his jacket as though trying to confirm every part of him was real. Jeremy wrapped both arms around the dog. "I know." His voice broke. "I know, buddy." Ranger whined again. Jeremy buried his face against the dog's neck. "I missed you too." Daniel looked away. Noah saw him wipe quickly beneath one eye and decided not to mention it. Ranger's tail hammered the grass. Jeremy laughed and cried at the same time. "You got old." Ranger licked his cheek. Jeremy pulled back enough to examine the silver around his muzzle. Yeah, me too." Ranger pressed against him again. For several minutes, the former handler simply held his dog. No commands, no uniform, no working posture. There was only a man sitting in wet grass and the animal who had once understood him better than almost anyone. Margaret watched from the porch. Tears moved silently down her cheeks. She had imagined Jeremy returning hundreds of times, in some versions. He walked through the door unexpectedly, in others. A car pulled into the driveway at Christmas. Sometimes she imagined being angry. Sometimes she imagined refusing to speak to him until he explained himself. But now that he was actually there, none of those rehearsed conversations survived. Jeremy finally looked toward the porch. Their eyes met. His smile disappeared. Ranger followed his gaze. Margaret stood beneath the porch light wearing the same green wool coat she had worn the day before. Her silver hair was loosely combed, and her face looked older than Jeremy remembered. That realization hit him harder than he expected. Time had continued here too, while he had been waiting to become someone worthy of returning. His mother had been growing older. "Mom." Margaret did not answer. Jeremy slowly got to his feet. His right leg nearly buckled. Ranger immediately moved beneath his hand. Jeremy rested his fingers on the dog's shoulder until his balance returned. The instinctive movement nearly made Margaret cry harder. Nothing had changed between them, and everything had. Jeremy walked towards the porch. Each step showed the slight hitch in his right leg. Margaret saw it. Jeremy noticed her seeing it. The old shame returned immediately. His shoulders tightened. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "I'm sorry." Margaret remained still. Jeremy looked down. "I should have called." She said nothing. "I should have come sooner." He swallowed. "I kept thinking I would come back when I was better." Margaret's mouth trembled. Jeremy continued before courage failed him. "When I could walk normally, when I wasn't angry anymore, when I figured out what I was supposed to do with my life." He looked at his damaged leg. "I didn't want you seeing me like this." Margaret slowly descended one step. Jeremy shook his head. "I know how proud you were of me." Another step. The uniform. The unit. Ranger. Margaret reached the bottom of the porch. "I thought if I came home like this, every time you looked at me, you'd remember what I used to be. Jeremy, I was ashamed." The words escaped before he could stop them. Noah lowered his gaze. Daniel quietly moved farther away with Ranger. Although the dog refused to go more than a few yards from Jeremy, Jeremy rubbed one hand across his face. "I lost the job. Then Ranger was transferred. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't do the only work I ever thought I was good at." His voice became rough, and everybody kept telling me I should be grateful because I was alive. Margaret listened. I was grateful. Jeremy stared at the ground. I was also angry. He looked toward her, and I hated myself for being angry. Margaret's eyes filled again. "So I left. Yes. And you thought disappearing would help me—" "No." Jeremy paused. "It helped me avoid you." The honesty hurt. But Margaret nodded. Jeremy continued. "Every week I told myself I'd call when I had something good to say. Then 1 week became a month, and 1 month became a year." Margaret whispered, "Yes, almost 2." Jeremy closed his eyes. "I know." Margaret stared at her son for almost 2 years. I wondered what I had done. Jeremy looked up sharply. I thought maybe you didn't want me anymore." His face changed. "Mom, you stopped calling. I was ashamed of myself. How was I supposed to know that Jeremy had no answer?" Margaret's voice remained gentle, which somehow made the words heavier. "You protected me from a truth I would have understood and replaced it with a silence I couldn't." Jeremy looked as if she had struck him. "I'm sorry." This time, Margaret stepped forward. Jeremy tried to keep speaking. "I should have." She wrapped both arms around him. He stopped. For a moment, his hands remained suspended beside her shoulders. Then he folded himself around his mother. Margaret pressed her cheek against his chest. Jeremy closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. "I know. I'm not who I was." Margaret pulled back just enough to look at him. "That is true." Jeremy blinked. She touched his face. "You have more gray hair." A broken laugh escaped him. "And apparently you've forgotten how to call your mother Mom. But listen to me." Her hands held his face the way they had when he was a boy. "You did not need to come home as a hero." Jeremy stared at her. "You only needed to come home." His face collapsed. The shame, fear, anger, and years of carefully maintained distance finally gave way. Jeremy bent forward and held her again. Margaret cried against his jacket. Noah quietly turned toward the street to give them privacy. Daniel pretended to inspect Ranger's leash. Neither fooled anyone. Ranger sat several feet away watching the reunion. After a moment, he stood. He walked toward Jeremy and Margaret, then pushed his large head between them. Margaret laughed through her tears. "Oh, honestly." Jeremy looked down, still jealous. Ranger leaned harder. Jeremy scratched behind his ear. Margaret wiped her cheeks. "I thought you didn't need me anymore." Jeremy shook his head. "I thought you deserved the man I used to be." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "That man was my son." She touched his chest. "So is this one." Jeremy lowered his eyes. Years of distance suddenly seemed ridiculous. Not harmless, but unnecessary. They had not stopped loving each other. They had simply stopped telling each other the truth. Jeremy had mistaken shame for protection. Margaret had mistaken silence for rejection. And between those two misunderstandings, nearly 2 years had disappeared. Ranger settled onto the porch between them. His head rested on Jeremy's boot while his back pressed against Margaret's leg. Jeremy looked down at him. The dog sighed deeply, as if exhausted by the foolishness of humans. Margaret smiled. What Jeremy rubbed Ranger's head? Nothing. He looked from Ranger to his mother, then toward the old porch corner where the German Shepherd had once waited night after night for him to return from duty. Jeremy's smile became softer. "I was just thinking about what he scratched Ranger behind the ears. Maybe this old dog just finished one last mission." Chown. A few weeks later, winter had begun settling gently over the Oregon town. Morning frost clung to porch railings. Bare maple branches reached across quiet streets, and the first pale sunlight often appeared behind low clouds just as people opened their shops for the day. The town itself looked much the same, but several lives inside it had changed. Jeremy Howard had moved back, not into Margaret's house. Despite her immediate suggestion that the spare bedroom was perfectly usable if one ignored the wallpaper. Instead, he rented a small one-story cottage 6 blocks away, close enough that he could walk over on good days and drive when his right leg hurt. The arrangement gave him independence without giving him another excuse to disappear. Margaret approved. Eventually, Jeremy had also found work again, not the work he had once believed defined him. 3 afternoons each week, he volunteered with a regional nonprofit that trained assistance dogs for veterans, older adults, and people recovering from serious injuries. The program operated from a modest training center outside town, where young dogs learned everything from retrieving dropped objects to opening lightweight doors and recognizing signs of physical distress. Jeremy had been reluctant when Noah first mentioned the opportunity. "I can't run anymore," he had said. The program director had answered, "Good. Most of the people we help can't either." That had ended the argument. Jeremy discovered that his old skills had not disappeared with his uniform. He still understood dogs. He still noticed the tiny details other people miss: the twitch of an ear, a change in breathing, a hesitation before a command. More importantly, he understood the people waiting for those dogs. He understood what it meant to wake up inside a body that no longer behaved the way it once had. He understood the humiliation of needing help, and because he understood it, he never spoke to the veterans or elderly clients as though they were fragile. He simply taught them how to work with their dogs. Some afternoons, Margaret visited the training center. She claimed she was only bringing sandwiches. Everyone knew better. Ranger knew better, too. The 7-year-old German Shepherd was still officially an active police canine, but his service days were numbered. Age had begun whispering through his body. He remained strong, alert, and disciplined. Yet, after long shifts, his rear legs stiffened slightly. Daniel noticed that Ranger slept longer after training and no longer recovered from intense work as quickly as he once had. The department veterinarian recommended retirement. Daniel accepted the decision with mixed feelings. For nearly 3 years, Ranger had been beside him during midnight calls, searches through freezing rain, school demonstrations, and quiet patrols where nothing happened except shared coffee and the occasional stolen French fry. A working dog became part of a handler's rhythm. Giving that up was difficult. But Daniel also knew where Ranger belonged. The department reviewed his history, Jeremy's previous service, Margaret's connection to him, and Ranger's unmistakable behavior whenever the two were nearby. The decision came one Tuesday afternoon. Daniel drove to Margaret's house with Noah. Jeremy was helping replace a damaged porch board when they arrived. He straightened carefully, one hand braced against the railing. "What happened?" Daniel smiled. "Relax." Ranger jumped down from the canine vehicle and immediately headed toward Jeremy. Daniel watched him go. His retirement papers were approved. Jeremy froze. Margaret stepped through the screen door. "What does that mean?" Daniel looked toward Jeremy. "It means when Ranger officially retires next month, the department has approved Jeremy as his retirement custodian." Margaret's hands went to her chest. Jeremy stared at Daniel. "You're serious?" Daniel nodded. "He's coming home." Jeremy looked down. Ranger was already sitting on his left foot. A laugh escaped him. Apparently, nobody asked him. Daniel looked at the dog. "I think he filed his paperwork weeks ago." Margaret laughed from the porch. Even Noah shook his head. It was strange how easily happiness could enter a place once people stopped trying to protect themselves from it. Noah began visiting occasionally, too. Sometimes he stopped by because he was working nearby, sometimes because Margaret made coffee strong enough to wake the dead and somehow always had enough for one more cup. He never admitted which reason mattered more. The damaged section of Margaret's roof was eventually repaired through a combination of the money she had saved and a discounted rate arranged by people in the neighborhood. Margaret refused outright donations. She did, however, accept a reasonable price negotiated between stubborn adults, as Helen described it, at Maple Street Bakery. Something else had changed. The small wooden box beside the register had become permanent. Take what you need. Leave what you can. Emily replaced the original handwritten sign with a polished wooden plaque. The system remained simple. Customers could pay for an extra loaf, muffin, or cup of coffee. Anyone who needed one could quietly ask. No proof, no paperwork, no explanations. Emily kept a chalkboard behind the counter showing how many prepaid items were available. Some mornings there were 5. Other mornings there were 30. Keith Torres became one of the program's most enthusiastic volunteers. Every Saturday, he loaded bread into his old compact car and delivered it to older residents who had difficulty leaving home. At first, he treated the deliveries almost like penance. Over time, something changed. He learned names. He learned which house had the dangerous front step, which retired teacher preferred rye bread, which widower pretended he disliked cinnamon rolls but always requested one for later. He discovered that service felt different when no one was forcing him to do it. One mistake had embarrassed him deeply, but it had also changed what he noticed. The bakery incident slowly stopped being remembered as the morning Margaret Harris was accused of stealing bread. Instead, people remembered it as the morning Ranger refused to obey the wrong assumption. and every Friday. Margaret still walked to Maple Street Bakery. Only now she rarely walked alone. Jeremy usually stayed on her left. Ranger walked on her right. Jeremy still limped. Margaret still pretended not to notice when he slowed down. Ranger noticed everything. He adjusted his pace automatically, never pulling ahead. On one cold Friday morning, the three entered the bakery together. The brass bell above the door rang. Emily looked up from behind the counter. There they are. Keith waved from beside the bread rack. Morning. Mrs. Harris. Morning. Young man. Margaret approached the display. Emily reached beneath the counter. I saved something for you. She brought out a larger country loaf than Margaret usually purchased. Margaret narrowed her eyes. That is not the small loaf. No. How much same price? Margaret looked suspicious. That sounds like charity. It's customer appreciation. That sounds like charity wearing lipstick. Jeremy turned away to hide a smile. Emily folded her arms. Margaret, Emily. They stared at each other. Keith whispered to Jeremy, Who wins these? No one. Eventually, Margaret paid for the loaf, exactly the amount Emily requested, not a penny less. She carried it outside beneath one arm. The morning had turned bright and cold, the kind of winter day when every breath appeared in front of you. Jeremy walked beside her. Ranger trotted calmly between them. They passed the bakery window, the hardware store, and a small park where frost still covered the grass. Then, Margaret stopped near a bench. She opened the paper wrapping. Jeremy watched her. Margaret broke the loaf in half. One half went back into the bag. The other she wrapped carefully in a clean paper napkin she had brought from home. Jeremy looked at her. You're still doing that. Margaret glanced toward him. Doing what you know exactly what. Several blocks later, they reached St. Andrew's Church. Thomas was sitting near the side entrance. He looked healthier than he had several weeks earlier. He had recently been given temporary housing through a church-supported program. But he still visited the church most mornings because it had become familiar ground. Margaret walked toward him. Breakfast. Thomas smiled. You don't have to keep doing this, I know. She handed him half the loaf. That is why it counts. Thomas accepted it with both hands. Thank you, Margaret. She nodded. No speech, no pity, just bread. Jeremy watched from several feet away. His mother returned and tucked the remaining half beneath her arm. He shook his head. Mom, some things never change. Margaret looked at him, then at Ranger, then back toward the bakery several blocks behind them. Good things don't need to. Jeremy smiled. Ranger sat between them. His tail tapped against the cold sidewalk. Once. Twice. Margaret rested one hand on his head. Jeremy rested the other. Weeks earlier, the same dog had stood on a rain-soaked sidewalk facing an old woman accused of stealing a loaf of bread. A simple command could have separated them. Instead, Ranger had remembered. He had remembered hands that once wiped mud from his paws, a kitchen drawer filled with treats, a porch where he waited for his handler, a family he had never stopped belonging to. And because one dog remembered what people had forgotten, a mother found her son again. Wounded handler found a new purpose. Young bakery worker learned to look twice before judging once. A neighborhood began noticing the lonely people living behind familiar doors. And one loaf of bread, broken quietly in two, became more than food. It became a reminder that kindness rarely disappears. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it travels, sometimes it returns years later on four paws. Margaret started walking again. Jeremy moved beside her. Ranger rose and followed between them. Three figures continued down the winter sidewalk together. This time, no one was being left behind. Sometimes, the greatest lessons arrive through the smallest moments. For Margaret, it began with nothing more than a loaf of bread and a painful misunderstanding. But that misunderstanding revealed something far greater, A dog who never forgot the family that once loved him. A son who discovered it was never too late to come home. And a community that learned to look beyond appearances before passing judgment. Ranger reminded everyone that loyalty is not simply obedience. True loyalty is born from kindness, trust, and the memories we leave in another heart. Jeremy learned that the people who truly love us do not need us to return as heroes. They simply need us to return. And Margaret showed that even when life gives us very little, we can still choose to break our bread in half and share what we have with someone who needs it more. Perhaps that is the heart of this story. Kindness is never wasted. The love we give may disappear from our sight for years. But sometimes, when we least expect it, it finds its way home. What did you think about Margaret, Jeremy, and Ranger's story? And if you were in Jeremy's place, would you have found the courage to come home sooner? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We would truly love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, please give the video a like. Share it with someone who might need this message today. And subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories about loyalty, second chances, and the extraordinary bond between people and animals. Thank you so much for watching and spending this time with us. We hope you'll come back again for many more stories that remind us there is still kindness, courage, and love in this world. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of one another.